Hello. Welcome again to our channel. We thank you if you are a returning viewer, and if you are new here, thank you for choosing our channel. Kindly help us grow our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Help us reach 100 subscribers. Now let us get to our story, The Many Lovers of the Pastor's Daughter.
Debbie grew up in the serene confines of her father's church, the Christ Redeemer's Assembly, situated in the heart of Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Christ Redeemer's Assembly was a small church filled with struggling people who desired a better life rather than a pious living. The hymns of praise echoed through the hearts of men and women, and the smell of incense filled the air. Pastor Emmanuel, a man of unwavering faith, had always believed that his daughter was destined for greatness within the church. Little did he know that Debbie had been marked by an ancient God, long before she was born. Unknown to her and her family, Debbie was dedicated in her earlier life to Zuba, the spirit of the rocks. The rocks of the Zuma people in central Nigeria were worshipped in ancient times. Debbie's parents were born in the village. They, like every other child from Zuma, were dedicated to Zuba, the god of protection. This ancient city was formed in the olden days when people fleeing from slave raiders hid in the crevices of the Zuma rock. The god protected them, but its demands were sometimes grievous. These demands were so grievous that some families fled the rocks, preferring to live with the threats of slavery. Being dedicated to Zuba was an everlasting pact. The binding dedication at birth couldn't be broken. But as time went by, people began to convert to other religions, and with that, many forgot about Zuba. But Zuba never forgets his children, especially the ones he has soul ties with. This powerful deity had claimed Debbie's soul as its own, binding her to its will. From a young age, whenever Debbie played near rocks, something dark would stir within her. The innocent games with her friends would take a violent turn, as she would shove a child down a hill or strike them with stones until blood stained the rocks. These were no accidents, they were the spirit's demand for sacrifice. As Debbie grew older, her strange behavior was dismissed as childish mischief. But the truth was far more sinister. At 19, during a hiking trip with friends to the famous Zuma rock, the full extent of Zuba's hold on her became terrifyingly clear. As Debbie and her friends climbed to the summit of the rock, a dark cloud descended on the summit. Debbie's eyes suddenly sparkled with an unnatural green flame. To the horror of her friends, she began to levitate. The air around her crackled with energy, as if the rock beneath her feet was coming to life. Her friends, paralyzed with fear, scrambled into the crevices of the rock, watching in terror as Debbie descended into a wicked rage. Growling, she spotted a goat wandering nearby, pounced on it, tearing it apart with her teeth as blood splattered across her face. She didn't stop until the goat was unrecognizable, its blood dripping from her hands. Exhausted, Debbie collapsed onto the cold stone and slept, oblivious to the nightmare that had just unfolded. When she awoke, the sun had risen, and she was alone. It was the next day. Her friends had fled, leaving her at the summit of the rock. There were no bloodstains on her, neither was there a dead goat anywhere. Debbie climbed down the rock and got back into the city much later. She went straight to her friend's place. Seeing her, the friends were so delighted to see Debbie. She stood wondering why they were that excited. They told her they had simply left because she followed a strange man into the rock's crevices and never came out. Debbie couldn't recall any of this, only a faint memory of an overwhelming hunger. Time passed, and Pastor Emmanuel's little church, located at the poorest neighborhood of Abuja, began to grow large, but in a curious and disturbing way. Men flocked to the congregation, most of them married, all of them drawn inexplicably to Debbie. The church, once dominated by women and families, was now filled with men, whose eyes followed Debbie with an unnatural intensity. Soon, men were abandoning their wives and children, devoting themselves entirely to her and donating all they had. The church became a place of whispers and secrets, with Debbie at the center of it all. Pastor Emmanuel became very worried when he began to notice a strange pattern. Every month, the man closest to Debbie would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a wife in mourning and a congregation in confusion. The pastor tried to rationalize it, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. As more men disappeared, his suspicions grew, and he started to investigate the circumstances surrounding his daughter's birth. These disappearances, rather than discourage members, attracted new members. For every man that died, 10 more new members were gained. One day, the wife of one of the dead men invited the police to investigate the death of her husband and his relationship with Debbie. Pastor Emmanuel was happy someone had gotten the police involved. He was desperate for answers too. But the investigations lasted only a week. This was because the head of the investigations team became enchanted by Debbie's aura. He and his entire team became members of Pastor Emmanuel's church before any investigations was done. This embarrassed the pastor more. He sought help from friends and family, but none understood what was happening. Pastor Emmanuel longed to know what the problem was. He wasn't comfortable with the growth of the church as it didn't feel right. One day he reached out to all the women whose husbands had died while serving Debbie. This infuriated Debbie when she heard about this. None of them would agree to meet with him because they were afraid of Debbie. But they were sure their husbands had been used as sacrifices to appease some evil forces. The truth unraveled slowly, each revelation more horrifying than the last. Pastor Emmanuel, concerned, had reached out to elders in his community as other pastors didn't want anything to do with him anymore. It didn't take long before he was told about the manifestation of Zuba through his daughter. Pastor Emmanuel didn't even know what Zuba was until the day he was told about it. Zuba had claimed Debbie long before she was born, and now, the deity was using her to gather souls. Souls of men who were drawn to her like moths to fire, only to be consumed by the spirit's insatiable hunger. Pastor Emmanuel's faith was tested like never before. His wife and other children, terrified by what was happening, abandoned him, leaving him to face the dark force alone. But he refused to give up on his daughter. He was determined to fight for her, even if it meant confronting Zuba itself and losing his life. His daughter was too important to him to let go. Debbie's authority in the church grew daily, so much that whenever Pastor Emmanuel was to preach, no one would pay any attention to him. If they did, the men would heckle him so much he would stop and invite Debbie to take over and preach. Debbie wasn't an ordained minister, but her lovers in the church had grown so much that Pastor Emmanuel lost control of the church and Debbie was made the overseer. The church was now fully in Debbie's control. Every man in the church would kiss the floor she walked on and shower her with gifts. She drove the best cars, wore the best designer clothes and had a mansion built in her name on a crescent in the most exclusive part of Abuja. Her influence began to grow outside the church as politicians sought her favors. Pastor Emmanuel would sit at Debbie's gate begging to see his daughter as he had been banished from the church. Every morning, he would find men all encamped outside the gate with him wanting to see Debbie. Some had been so enchanted by Debbie that they would cry and beg the guards. He noticed one thing though: when the men caught a glimpse of his daughter, they became violent and destructive. On one of the days, the men got too excited and beat up Pastor Emmanuel for trying to talk to his daughter. Debbie looked on as they beat up her father and didn't intervene. Any man who hears the commotion and tries to save the pastor would suddenly get enchanted and join in the beating. The pastor was saved by a group of women who had been in search of their husbands, who found them beating the pastor. They pulled him out of the crowd and rushed him to the hospital. At the hospital, they discovered Pastor Emmanuel had a broken jaw, a broken nose, and the ankle on his right leg was also broken. This kept him away for a few months. When he returned, Pastor Emmanuel discovered how many men had joined the church and how many more had been consumed by Zuba through Debbie. But he was more prepared to get his daughter back. In the end, Pastor Emmanuel confronted Zuba at the same place where Debbie's fate had been sealed. The summit of Zuma Rock. He was certain Zuba wanted him out of the way as only he could deliver his daughter. The Christ Redeemer's assembly was now a spectacle. Young men filled the church as they longed to meet with Debbie. This was all Zuba's plan. Debbie was unmarried but yet had lots of admirers. She chose who to be with every month. Wives, mothers, and girlfriends fought to keep their sons away from the church as they didn't want to lose them. The government saw nothing wrong with the church or the disappearance of the men. Everyone who had tried to confront Debbie had either become a member of the church or died. One day, Debbie announced that the church would be having its first ever miracle prayer crusade at the top of the Zuma Rock. But the crusade was for only young boys from the ages of 1 to 14. She demanded all the men who are members of the church and those who desire to have big miracles bring in their sons, nephews, and any male child they could find within the age range. The news of the crusade spread across town quickly. Men moved around like possessed sheep, looking for young boys to take with them. Those who didn't have sons scampered around looking for where they could rent boys. Others went to orphanages and quickly adopted boys for the sake of this crusade. Street beggars were paid by men to follow them to the crusade. On the day of the event, there was a long procession of men and young boys marching up the rock. Everyone wore a white robe and held black burning candles. Not everyone could fit at the top of the rock as it was packed full with people. The crowd began to jump in excitement when Debbie was carried up the rock dressed like an ancient Egyptian princess. 6 hefty young men carried her on a golden chair. They placed the chair at the center of the rock and then the rock began to tremor. Debbie began chanting and urged everyone else to chant. A spirit went into every boy and they began ramming their heads against the rock. Blood splattered everywhere on the rock and it began to flow down on its sides. That evening many boys went missing and no one remembered what happened. The next morning Pastor Emmanuel heard the stories of the crusade. The blood was still on the rock when he went visiting the rock, but no one complained about the missing boys. He went to his daughter's house and was stopped at the gate as usual. By this time Pastor Emmanuel had become homeless and looked like a madman walking the streets. He cried outside her house, "Give me my daughter back, you evil spirit!" No one answered him. After a few hours of shouting, he was exhausted and just laid there at her gate. Some days later a young man picked Pastor Emmanuel off the streets and gave him a home to live in. He encouraged the pastor to trust God and believe. But Pastor Emmanuel, in a desperate attempt to save his daughter, turned to ancient rites, fasting, and prayers. He sought out the elders and spiritual warriors, who had knowledge of the old gods, and together, they waged a spiritual battle against Zuba. It was a fight that cost him everything. He lost his left eye one night when a rock flew out of nowhere and hit him in the eye while he slept. After losing his left eye to the flying rock, Pastor Emmanuel's world grew darker, not just physically but spiritually. The loss of his eye was just the beginning of a series of calamities that tested his resolve and faith like never before. One evening, as Pastor Emmanuel prepared for another night of prayers, a loud buzzing sound filled the air. He opened his one good eye to see a massive swarm of locusts descending upon his small roadside shack. The insects were only at he screamed for help, but it appeared no one could hear him scream. The locusts devoured everything in sight, including the sparse food he had managed to gather. They clawed at his skin, biting and tearing until he was forced to flee into the streets, leaving behind the meager shelter he called home. The pastor's ordeal with Zuba didn't end with the plague of locusts. His dreams were also haunted. Every night, Pastor Emmanuel was haunted by vivid nightmares. In these dreams, he saw Debbie, not as his daughter, but as a black dust-like creature floating through the air, her eyes glowing with the evil light of Zuba. She would mock him, taunting him for his failures as a father and a man of God. These nightmares would leave him shaken so much they deprived him of sleep and slowly wearing down his spirit. Each morning, he awoke more exhausted than the last, his faith fraying at the edges. Weakened by hunger, lack of sleep, and dehydration, Pastor Emmanuel soon fell ill again. A fever raged through his body, leaving him delirious. As he lay on the ground, shivering and sweating, he began to see visions. In his fevered state, he saw the spirits of the men who had died because of Debbie. They surrounded him, accusing him of failing them, of failing to protect their families. They told him that his fight against Zuba was futile and that he would soon join them in death. One night, as the fever reached its peak, Pastor Emmanuel heard a voice, not in his dreams, but in the waking world. It was the voice of Zuba, cold and mocking. "You are nothing, Emmanuel," it whispered. "Your faith cannot save you. I have taken your eye, your daughter and your church, and soon, I will take your soul." The voice echoed through his mind, relentless, driving him to the brink of madness. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but the words continued, seeping into his very being. Emmanuel, battered and broken, found himself standing at the edge of a cliff one fateful evening. Below, the jagged rocks called to him, offering an end to his suffering. The voice of Zuba encouraged him to jump, to end the torment and join the spirits of the damned. Emmanuel's hand shook as he looked down, contemplating the release that death could bring. But just as he was about to step forward, a small, weak voice in his heart reminded him of Debbie. She was still out there, trapped in the grip of the ancient god, and only he could save her. This final test of his faith reignited a spark of resolve within him. Pastor Emmanuel stepped back from the cliff, determined to fight on. He might have been battered, broken, and half-blind, but his love for his daughter was stronger than any force of darkness. That same day, in anger, the sky darkened as he stood on the rock summoning the god, his faith the only weapon he had left. With every word of prayer, he called upon the power of the Almighty to deliver his daughter from the demon of Zuba that had possessed her. Zuba appeared once again in a strong whistling wind that tossed the pastor about. He fell off the rock, but was only saved by holding onto a branch. The battle was fierce. Debbie appeared at the summit with a strange being beside her. A third and unseen force beat the pastor so much he could barely walk. Every time the pastor poured water on the rocks, a sizzling noise was heard. Debbie levitated and fell from Pastor Emmanuel's prayers, and then a strange man came out of the crevice and entered into Debbie. She got up again growling and levitating, but Emmanuel's love for his daughter was unwavering. As he prayed, Debbie's body convulsed, the spirit of Zuba thrashing within her, unwilling to let go. But Emmanuel's faith was stronger, and with one final, desperate plea he cast the spirit out, freeing Debbie from its grip. She laid motionless on the rock, but Pastor Emmanuel wasn't fooled. He looked around waiting for another of the men to come out of the rocks and enter into Debbie again. He waited a while but didn't see or hear any growling anymore. The spirit dissipated into the air, the sky cleared, and Debbie got off the ground and fell into her father's arms, unconscious but alive. The battle had been won, but the scars remained. The church was no more, and Pastor Emmanuel was a broken man, but he had saved his daughter from a fate worse than death. Months later Debbie awoke from her slumber, her mind clear, her soul her own. The memories of what had happened were a blur, but she knew one thing for certain: she had been saved, not by the church, but by the unwavering love of her father. Together, they would rebuild, far from the shadows of the past, and away from the rocks where dark spirits dwelled. The end. Thank you for watching. Please watch out for our next video. The Fulani Man and his Igbo Lover. Please like, share and subscribe.